had never done before. It passed a bill to create the 51st state by giving the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C., statehood. Members of the House of Representatives each represent between 500,000 and 1 million Americans. D.C.'s 700,000 residents are represented by this woman, Eleanor Holmes Norton. But she couldn't vote on the statehood bill because she's different from other members. She can speak on the floor and introduce bills, but she can't actually vote.
Cocked.
Americans in territories like Puerto Rico and Guam are also represented in Congress by delegates who can't vote. But Americans in these places don't pay federal taxes to the U.S. government. D.C. residents do. In fact, in D.C., the average person pays more in federal taxes than in any state. And they're not happy about it. It's why D.C.'s license plates say taxation without representation. President Trump has promised to block Washington, D.C. from becoming a state, so that House vote was mostly symbolic. But Washington, D.C.'s residents are clear on what they want. So will D.C. ever actually become a state? And should it? In the U.S., the federal government is not supposed to be based in a state. The Constitution says it should be in a neutral federal district, what today is called the District of Columbia. But since the founding of the country, the district has grown into a major city.
For most of its existence as a city, the district has been under the control of the United States Congress.
Starting in the 1960s, Congress made some concessions to D.C.'s calls for representation. It granted them electoral college votes for presidential elections.
It's literally too black. That's it. Not gonna happen. Too black and too poor. And it will never, Republicans will never let it happen. Why the fuck? Just, we still have the electoral college of this country. Like, nope. DC ain't poor. It's Democrat and it's fucking poor. All the rich people that live in DC, yeah, sure, they live in DC, but their residences often, their second residences are in fucking DC. The people who are saying DC ain't poor think that like rich people literally live in DC. No, rich people live in Virginia and rich people live in the surrounding areas of DC. Rich people are not living in DC. The people that live in DC are mostly poor and black people. A lot of people categorized as wealthy live in DC. The house next to mine sold 2 years ago for 1.1 million. Okay, dude. Okay, dude. I'm not saying the DC housing market is good or that there aren't really wealthy parts of DC. Of course there are really wealthy parts of DC. That's where the government is.
Sorry.
But by and large, the majority of the population in DC are not wealthy.
DC isn't poor, probably never went a block outside of
it's
Union
people that
Station
have their
or the
second
Museum
homes in DC.
Or just never went there in general.
Dude, H. Bizzle, don't you live there? What the fuck? In Georgetown. Live predominantly in DC. They live in the surrounding regions. Calling trading spouses with map videos? Yeah, well.
A non-voting member in Congress, and finally, the right to elect their own local government. But because Congress still completely controls their budget, they often undermine.
Income inequality in DC is the highest in the country. The district has a higher level of income inequality than any state in the country, with households in the top 20% of income having 29 times more income than the bottom 20%. The bottom fifth DC households are just 2% of total DC income in 2016. The second part, I think, isn't the second highest income inequality in the country in Louisiana, in New Orleans.
Devil.
Article from 2017. It's like saying that New Orleans is incredibly wealthy when it also has the most amount of poor people and some of the richest people in the same area. Oh man, I said 2017. Like what happened? Ranking cities. When cities and metros are measured by inequality, economic segregation, affordability, new urban crisis, surprising hits and misses. What? Why I want to show? That's weird. What the fuck is this? What? Is this a joke? Are they paywalling this shit? What the fuck? U.S. cities with most to least income inequality. Yeah, New Orleans is number 2. Atlanta's number 1. Damn, DC went down to number 9 in 2 years. Donald Trump saved, folks. Donald Trump saved DC. Donald Trump saved DC, folks. I'm telling you, believe me. Believe me, we've drained the swamp. And by that, I mean we've kicked out all the poors. So no longer do they live here. Oh, Gini coefficient of income inequality 2017. Never mind. This is also from 2017. Well, so was this. This one, the Gini coefficient of income inequality in this shows a different reality than this. I don't know what the f going on here. What? Oh, it's the... Okay. Regardless, DC has... Again, DC is in the top 10 of highest income inequality in the nation. There you go. New Orleans being number 2, because I was correct about it. Saying that New Orleans is an incredibly wealthy area just by looking at GDP per capita does not change the reality of the situation there for poor people. Segregation is worse in DC today than it was in the 60s. Point was, they're not going to get statehood because it is a reliably democratic state if it were to become a state. Reliably democratic. And not going to happen. It would be a gigantic loss of power for the Republicans.
DC's local government, which is another major reason DC residents want statehood.
Like most cities in the United States, it is a progressive city, and so its laws conflict in some measure with that of conservative Republicans.
That's understating it a little. In the 2016 election, Trump only got a whopping 4% of the vote in DC. Congress has kept DC from using their local tax dollars on things like abortion services or needle exchange programs to reduce HIV/AIDS. They've tried to undercut DC's gun laws and same-sex marriage benefits, and they stopped the city from legalizing marijuana.
There are issues in the country that are very controversial that Republicans can't do anything about, so they use the district as a prop.
Holmes Norton's plan would turn most of the District of Columbia into a new state called the Douglas Commonwealth. There would still be a federal district around the actual government buildings, but the remaining 66 square miles of neighborhoods would become the newest, smallest state. But it would still have a larger population than 2 states, and would be about the same size as 4 others. So what's the holdup? Well, representatives from other states have lots of reasons.
The Founding Fathers did not intend for Washington, D.C. to be a state.
Washington, D.C. is a city, not a state.
There is no manufacturing.
Notice how everyone is a fucking Republican.
There is no mining or logging.
But it's not...
I wonder what the fucking reason is. Oh, probably because they love sucking the Founding Fathers, dead Founding Fathers corpse cocks. That's what it is, right? No. Of course not. That's not the reason, because they just don't want more black people to have political power.
Not a coincidence that every representative speaking out against statehood here is Republican. Statehood would give DC, and most likely the Democratic Party,
there you go,
1 more vote in the House of Representatives, and 2 more votes in the Senate, which means the actual obstacle to statehood is politics.
Indeed, always, statehood is a political question.
In the decades after the U.S. was founded, new states were regularly added, and without much issue, until 1818, when Missouri wanted to become a new state. At that time, power in Congress was evenly balanced between states that allowed slavery and states that didn't.
Taxation without
Missouri, which would become a
representation.
slave state,
Make
would
DC a
tip that
state.
balance, which representatives of the free states didn't want. So Congress came up with a compromise. Missouri would be added at the same time as Maine, a free state, a pair to keep the political balance. After that, states were mostly added in pairs. Arkansas, a slave state, with Michigan, a free state. Florida, a slave state, with Iowa, a free state. Texas, a slave state, with Wisconsin, a free state. And that system has also been used to keep the balance between the political parties. Most recently in 1959, with the addition of Hawaii, which leaned Republican at the time, and Alaska, which leaned Democratic. Right now, Democrats control one house of Congress, but Republicans control the other one.
It's like the Thanos meme. All things centered as it should be.
As well as the presidency. And as long as that's the case, DC is unlikely.
Yeah, someone in the chat already pointed this out, but holy shit, literally everything in American politics centers around slavery. Yes. Which is why I don't spend a ridiculous amount of time criticizing shit like the 1619 Project and get mad at people like Tom Cotton who continue to say, you know, it's necessary evil.
Likely to become a state on its own.
It would certainly be easier if there were some ready jurisdiction to be made a state that was a Republican jurisdiction.
The last time the House voted on DC statehood was in 1993, when Democrats had an even bigger majority than they do today. The bill still failed, with more than 100 Democrats voting no. 2020 is turning out to be different.
Coronavirus begins to take a toll on the U.S. economy.
More than 6 million Americans filed jobless claims.
In March, as millions lost their jobs, Congress passed a coronavirus relief bill, giving each state at least $1 billion. But DC, which is usually treated like a state in most congressional funding, was instead treated as a U.S. territory and got less than half that.
Being treated like a territory is shocking.
I wonder what could be the reason why DC was treated like a territory? If there was only a president who routinely undermined democratic cities and routinely undermined any like democratic safe havens. And by the way, you can substitute the word Democrat for black in this circumstance too, because those places also have a higher population of black people, with the exception of southern states that are reliably red, but not the cities themselves.
You don't love the spirit
Are you
of
saying
justice.
that Democrats suck at
You
politics?
love your
Yeah,
father,
it's the fault
devil.
of the Democrats
Feel
that we
Trump.
have a psychotic president who treats party affiliation like they're people that are not a part of your fucking country. Like, for all of Obama's glaring failures, if he ever did anything like this, no, just because Democrats are bad at doing politics doesn't mean that like the president and the American government is supposed to treat them like as hostile entities. What do you guys mean it is though? Yeah, Democrats are bad at politics. Who cares? We're not having a conversation about that right now.
It's infuriating.
In June, as protests against police violence,
Remember, they literally deployed federal troops in DC first. Again, big population of black people, testing out the federal agency, the powers of federal troopers, federal paramilitaries.
spread across the country, the National Guard patrolled parts of the city. That kind of occupation would be illegal in every state, but not DC.
There shouldn't be troops from other states in Washington, D.C.
The last several days demonstrate that our fight for statehood is also about our right to autonomy.
It's time for statehood to come to Washington, D.C.
We've seen in very painful and frankly violent terms what the lack of statehood can bring to the residents of the District of Columbia.
Right now, the people in charge of the federal government oppose DC statehood, but it only takes one election to change that.
My own grandfather became one of the first African Americans in the DC Fire Department. His father, Richard Holmes, was a runaway slave from Virginia.
PR's 2 million people with DC will get it first. What the of course, Puerto Rico is not going to get it. Puerto Rico also is brown and not a part of the mainland. Don't be crazy. This way, without Puerto Rico getting statehood, vulturous financial firms can continue to exploit Puerto Rico and treat it like an island, like a tourism island that gets destroyed over and over again by fucking hurricanes. And then they come back and can exploit it some more. The people of Puerto Rico suffering, obviously.
He walked to freedom but he didn't walk to equality. So I
Also,
figured,
then on top of that, the people of Puerto Rico also have, some people at the very least, have different expectations.
You don't
Some people
love
want
the
full
spirit of
independence
justice. You
and
love
not
your
statehood.
father,
I
the
am,
devil.
as someone
I
who
like
is,
Hassan.
who doesn't have any sort of, as someone who doesn't have, obviously, any sort of allegiance
You
to
don't love the
Puerto
spirit
Rico
of
beyond the
justice.
fact that
You love
Americans
your father,
live
the
there, and
devil.
Puerto Ricans live there.
We need DC and PR statehood.
I think
as
that
long as
statehood
they
is
want
a
it.
better
The
idea
Senate is
than
supervised
full
minority
independence.
rule.
But then again, I understand why the people of Puerto Rico would want complete independence, except it would be devastating financially for them.
I'm picking up where he left off. He got us to freedom. He got the Holmes family to freedom. Now I've got to get the Holmes family and all my constituents to equality.